In May 1945, right after the war ended, pollsters asked the people of France a simple question. Who deserves the most credit for defeating Nazi Germany? These were the people the Allies had just liberated. They'd lived through the occupation. They watched the war unfold from the front row. 57% said the Soviet Union, only 20% said America. Now here's where it gets interesting. They asked the same question again in 2004, 60 years later. The numbers had completely reversed. 58% now credited America, only 20% said the Soviets. The facts of the war hadn't changed. The battles were the same, the casualties were the same, but somehow, what people believed about those facts had been completely rewritten. Stefan Grimaldi, director of the Caen Memorial Museum in Normandy, explained what happened. He said, in 1945, the great ally was Stalin and the USSR. But 50 years later, it's the US that won, for the very simple reason that, in the meantime, we had the Cold War. This is a video about how that happened, not just with this myth, but with at least 8 major lies about World War II that most of us were taught as fact. Some came from Cold War propaganda. Some came from self-serving memoirs written by Nazi generals. And some came from a film industry that turned the most complex war in human history into a simple story of American heroism. I've spent months going through the declassified documents, the battlefield statistics, and the archives. And what I've found is a war far more complex, more morally ambiguous, and more surprising than the one most of us think we know. Let's start with the big one, the foundation that everything else is built on. 80% of all German military casualties occurred on the Eastern Front, not fighting Americans, not fighting the British, fighting the Soviets. The Soviet Union mobilized 34.5 million soldiers over the course of the war. America mobilized 16.4 million, and those were split between Europe and the Pacific. The Soviets suffered roughly 27 million dead. America lost 407,000. That's a ratio of about 70-1. The National World War II Museum itself states that 75 to 80% of the Wehrmacht had to be deployed in the East for most of the war. The Western Allies were fighting the smaller portion of Hitler's army. And here's what really matters. The real turning points of the war, the battles that actually broke the German military, were all Eastern Front battles. Moscow in 1941, Stalingrad in 1942 and 43, Kursk in 1943. All of these happened before D-Day. David Glantz is a retired U.S. Army colonel and probably the most respected Western scholar of the Eastern Front. His conclusion was that without Western intervention, the Soviets would still have defeated Germany. It would have taken 12 to 18 months longer. And in his words, Soviet soldiers would have waited at France's Atlantic beaches rather than meeting the Allies. At the Elbe, D-Day's primary significance wasn't military, it was political. It ensured that Western democracies would shape post-war Europe rather than letting Stalin take all of it. But that's not what we were taught. And there's a reason for that. Hollywood produced roughly 500 war films between 1942 and 1945 alone. Virtually all of them centered on American heroism. Then came the Cold War, and suddenly giving credit to the Soviets became politically unacceptable. The curriculum shifted, the movies kept coming, and within 2 generations, the people who actually lived through the war were outnumbered by people who learned about it from Saving Private Ryan. "16 days after D-Day, the Soviets launched an offensive that most Americans have never even heard of. It was called Operation Bagration. Here's how the numbers compare. On D-Day, the Allies landed 156,000 troops. For Bagration, the Soviets deployed 2.3 million. That's almost 15 times as many soldiers. Professor Jeffrey Wawrow put it bluntly. You had 10 times as many Russians fighting in Bagration as you had Anglo-American troops landing on the Normandy beaches, and 3 times as many Germans trying to hold up the Russian advance as defending the Atlantic Wall. The result was the largest German military defeat in history. 28 of 34 divisions in Army Group Center were completely destroyed. German casualties exceeded 450,000. German losses in Normandy during the same period were less than half that number. The Imperial War Museums called it arguably the greatest military defeat of all time. And here's a statistic that really puts it in perspective. The casualties suffered by the Soviets in a single counteroffensive at Kursk exceeded total American dead in the entire war. One battle versus the entire war. Richard Overy, one of Britain's foremost WWII historians, summed it up. Soviet forces destroyed or disabled an estimated 607 Axis divisions between 1941 and 1945. The scale and geographical extent of the Eastern Front dwarfed all earlier warfare. But if you went to school in America, you probably spent weeks learning about Normandy and maybe one class period, if that, on the entire Eastern Front. This might be the most emotionally charged myth on this list. The claim that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved 1 million American lives by preventing an invasion of Japan. Stanford historian Barton Bernstein traced the origins of this claim. What he found was that it has no basis in actual wartime military planning documents. The real estimates from the Joint War Plans Committee, dated June 15, 1945, projected roughly 40,000 to 46,000 American dead for a full invasion. General Marshall told Truman that casualties for the Kyushu landing would not exceed those from Luzon, which was approximately 31,000. MacArthur predicted 95,000 total casualties in 90 days. So where did the million number come from? It was inserted after the war. Secretary of War Stimson published an article in Harper's Magazine in 1947 claiming over 1 million casualties. But Bernstein found that Stimson's original draft said 100,000s. The number was inflated later. McGeorge Bundy, who helped write that article, later admitted, defenders of the use of the bomb were not always careful about the number of casualties expected. But here's what makes this even more complicated. What actually drove Japan's surrender is far more complex than just the bombs. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's landmark 2005 study, published by Harvard University Press, demonstrated that the Soviet declaration of war on Japan on August 8th was equally or more important than the atomic bombs. Japan had pinned its last diplomatic hopes on Soviet mediation. They were trying to get Stalin to negotiate better surrender terms. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria destroyed that strategy entirely. Emperor Hirohito himself, on August 9th, before he even learned about Nagasaki, told his advisors, "The Soviet Union declared war against us. Because of this, it is necessary to study and decide on the termination of the war." The National World War II Museum confirms that the news of the Nagasaki bomb had no effect on the Supreme War Council's deliberations that day. They were focused on the Soviets. And here's something that rarely gets mentioned. 7 of 8 top U.S. military commanders believed the bombs were unnecessary. Eisenhower called them completely unnecessary since Japan was already defeated. Admiral Leahy, the highest-ranking military officer in the entire war, wrote, "The use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. Even the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned." The bomb saved 1 million lives narrative became political orthodoxy because it served as moral justification for the only use of nuclear weapons in history. Questioning it feels like dishonoring the troops, but the historical record tells a very different story. This is the myth that the regular German military was a professional, apolitical force uninvolved in the Holocaust, that only the SS committed atrocities. And this myth wasn't just an accident of history. It was deliberately constructed during the Cold War with American help. Let me give you the facts first. Over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war died under Wehrmacht custody, not SS, Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht issued the Barbarossa Decree in May 1941, which explicitly exempted German soldiers from prosecution for crimes against civilians. They issued the Commissar Order in June 1941, mandating the summary execution of all captured Soviet political officers. These were official Wehrmacht orders. Historians Alex Kay and David Stahl concluded that a substantial majority of the 10 million German soldiers who served on the Eastern Front were involved in crimes of some kind. Historian Felix Römer stated flatly, "Without the Wehrmacht, this genocide would not have happened." So how did this myth get created? The origin is traceable to a specific document, the General's Memorandum of November 1945. It was co-authored by Franz Halder, Walter von Brauchitsch, and Erich von Manstein. And here's the part they don't teach you. It was written at the suggestion of American General William Donovan of the OSS, who viewed the Soviet Union as the new primary threat. Halder subsequently directed a U.S. Army historical program overseeing 700 former German officers writing accounts of the Eastern Front. The U.S. military shielded him from prosecution in exchange. The myth entered popular culture through best-selling memoirs. Guderian's Panzer Leader sold over 180,000 copies. Manstein's Lost Victories became a military classic. All of these books systematically blamed defeats on Hitler, claimed victories for themselves, and conveniently omitted their participation in war crimes. Historian Volker Berghan called Manstein's book totally unreliable and noted that if more had been known about his war crimes, he might have been hanged. The myth wasn't finally shattered in Germany until 1995, when the Wehrmacht exhibition opened and traveled the country until 2004. 800,000 people viewed 1,380 photographs documenting Wehrmacht atrocities, photographs their own grandfathers had taken. The Tiger tank, the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet. German engineering supremacy is one of the most pervasive myths in popular culture, and one of the easiest to debunk with production data alone. Germany produced 1,347 Tiger IS during the entire war. The Allies produced 49,000 Shermans. The Soviets built 84,000 T-34s. Each Tiger required roughly 300,000 man-hours to build. A Sherman took about 48,000. Tigers were logistical nightmares. A single Tiger company consumed the same maintenance resources as an entire battalion of Panzer IVs. Stephen Zaloga, probably the leading Western tank historian, found that the popular myths that Panthers enjoyed a 5-to-1 kill ratio against Shermans have no basis at all in the historical records. Here's a fact that might surprise you. American forces only encountered 2 or 3 Tiger I tanks in all of Europe. The fearsome Tiger that dominates every video game and movie was statistically irrelevant on the Western Front. The V-2 rocket consumed approximately 2 to 3 billion wartime dollars, comparable to the Manhattan Project. And it carried only a 1-ton warhead so inaccurate it could hit nothing smaller than a city. Freeman Dyson, who worked for Allied Bomber Command, observed, "The V-2 program was almost as good as if Hitler had adopted a policy of unilateral disarmament." The entire tonnage of explosives delivered by V-2s over 7 months, could be dropped in a single RAF bombing raid. And here's the darkest part. The V-2 is perhaps the only weapon system to have caused more deaths by its production than its deployment. 12,000 forced laborers died building them versus approximately 9,000 killed by the rockets themselves. Adam Tooze's Wolfson Prize-winning book, The Wages of Destruction, demolished the broader myth. Germany was fundamentally resource poor. They lacked oil, rubber, iron, and food. The famous spear miracle of war production was largely a propaganda invention. William Knudsen, the U.S. war production executive, summarized the Allied advantage simply: "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." Hollywood has so thoroughly Americanized the Normandy landings that most viewers would be startled by the actual numbers. Historian James Holland, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, documented the breakdown. On June 6, 1944, 83,115 British and Canadian troops landed versus 73,000 Americans. Of 1,213 warships, 892 were British and only 200 were American. Of 4,126 landing craft, 3,261 were British and 805 American. 2/3 of the 12,000 aircraft were British. 3 of the 5 beaches, Gold, Sword, and Juno, were British and Canadian. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division at Juno Beach actually pushed farther inland than any other force on D-Day. The entire command structure beneath Eisenhower, his deputy, and all 3 service chiefs was British. And here's something else that gets lost. The 77-day Battle of Normandy had an average daily casualty rate of 6,870. That's worse than the Somme, worse than Passchendaele, worse than Verdun, 3 battles we use as benchmarks for the horror of World War I. D-Day was absolutely a crucial operation, but it was a multinational effort, and the narrative that it was primarily American is a product of post-war storytelling, not historical fact. This myth is so persistent, it's become a punchline. But Professor Michael Bourlet of the Saint-Cyr Military Academy calls it a myth constructed by Pétain's Vichy regime, unfortunately still used today. Let's look at what actually happened. France lost approximately 60,000 to 92,000 soldiers killed in just 6 weeks of fighting, casualties comparable to many major battles of the entire war. The German army suffered 157,000 casualties and lost 30% of its tanks and aircraft in the process. France actually had more tanks than Germany, 3,254 versus 2,439. French tanks like the Somme S-35 were rated superior to German panzers. France was also more motorized, 300,000 vehicles versus Germany's 120,000. Only 10% of the German army was motorized in 1940. The failure wasn't courage. It was intelligence failures, specifically missing the Ardennes thrust despite multiple warnings. It was doctrine, dispersing tanks among infantry instead of concentrating them. And it was leadership, committing the best mobile forces into Belgium and leaving no reserves. And here's what happened after the formal surrender. The French resistance fielded 100,000 armed fighters by May 1944. On D-Day night alone, they carried out over 1,000 sabotage operations, destroying 52 locomotives and cutting rail lines in over 500 places. Eisenhower himself stated the resistance was invaluable and that without it, the fighting in France would have lasted much longer and would have caused more casualties. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable myth on this list. The idea that the Allies had no idea what was happening until soldiers walked into Bergen-Belsen and Dachau in 1945. The timeline of what the Allies actually knew is damning. By December 17, 1942, 3 years before the camp liberations, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and 9 Allied governments publicly condemned the cold-blooded extermination of Jews in a joint declaration. In August 1942, the Rigner telegram reached American and British diplomats with authoritative information about Hitler's plan to systematically exterminate all European Jews. The U.S. State Department suppressed it, calling it the fantastic nature of the allegation and a wild rumor inspired by Jewish fears. By November 1942, American newspapers published reports that 2 million Jews had already been murdered. In July 1943, Polish courier John Karski, who had been smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto and witnessed conditions firsthand, personally briefed President Roosevelt at the White House. FDR promised the Allies would win the war, but made no mention of rescuing Jews. In April 1944, Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler escaped Auschwitz and produced a 33-page report detailing gas chambers, maps of the camp, and victim numbers. By summer 1944, Allied bombers were already striking targets near Auschwitz. The Buna plant at Monowitz was bombed repeatedly from August through December 1944. Requests to bomb the death camp itself or its rail lines were rejected. The Treasury Department discovered that the State Department had been actively blocking information about the genocide. They prepared a devastating internal report titled Personal Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this government in the Murder of the Jews. Roosevelt held 423 press conferences between the outbreak of war and his death. He never once publicly mentioned the plight of European Jewry, not once. These 8 myths aren't academic curiosities. They shape how we understand power, morality, and our country's role in the world. The inflation of the million lives saved figure provided decades of political cover for nuclear weapons policy. The Clean Wehrmacht myth enabled NATO's integration of West Germany. The erasure of Soviet contributions fueled a triumphalist narrative that distorted Cold War foreign policy and continues to shape how we see ourselves today. The pattern connecting every myth is consistent. Complexity was replaced with simplicity, moral ambiguity was replaced with moral clarity, and multinational sacrifice was replaced with American exceptionalism. Hollywood, Cold War politics, and the self-serving memoirs of defeated generals each played reinforcing roles. One built on the other until the narrative became unquestionable. Richard Overy captured the broader lesson when he wrote, "The Allied victory in 1945 has since come to seem inevitable." It was not. And Rob Citino of the National WWII Museum warned, "Historians owe it to the millions of people who participated in this event and the millions who died to delve as deeply as possible into why this all happened." The most powerful corrective may be the simplest data point of all. In 1945, the people who had just lived through the war knew who bore its greatest burden. They named the Soviet Union. It took decades of deliberate myth-making to convince them, and us, otherwise. If you found this valuable, I've got more. Deep dives into World War II history that challenge the conventional narrative. The next video on screen goes even deeper into one of these topics, and if you want to fact-check anything I've said, every source I used is listed in the description. That's how this should work. History isn't about telling comfortable stories, it's about getting as close to the truth as we can. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.